misinterpretations. So it is not very usual for Indians to celebrate a foreign ambassador. But Octavio Paz was a very unique ambassador who got involved with the creative and intellectual life of this country. For the brief period in which he was here, he made a deep impact, which impact even now persists in some ways. Many of us who grew up at that time, I was very young, were then obsessed with evolution, social change, etc. And comes a Spanish poet who tells us that there are other things to look for, that there is the erotic impulse, that there is a lot of heritage of your own which evokes a different kind of response. So, we thought 20 years after his death, he came to India once, and we had that to later. May I first request, and there are two persons here who knew Paz, and they are both major painters of this country, Krishan Khanna and Ghulam Sheikh. Mexico, and who has come all the way, Alberto Sanchez. If I mispronounce it, please pardon. He was managing editor of Paz's last journal, and then became an independent publisher who had the good fortune of publishing some of Paz's work. So, as you see, next in the an exhibition of posters inspired by Paz and his poetry. Most of them are Mexican, I think, but some of them are also Indian. And so there is, Paz uses a characteristic word that he used quite often, convergence. So this exhibition also is a convergence, and this event itself is an evidence of continuing convergence between various trends. Kapilaji has come, I welcome her. Dr. Kapila Paz is one of our most eminent scholars. You see, the eminence in this country is now in its 90s. Most. Kapilaji, come here. That we have a book which we have published. There was a foundation that's published through Vadera Academy. This is called India Remembers Past. So we asked our friends here to release the book, and the book release will also declare this exhibition open. This is killing two birds with a single stone, if you like. And then, all of us, including me, will be talking to you about our encounters and experiences with Paz. So may I first request Mr. Krishan Khanna, Mr. Ghulam Sheikh, and just to release the book. It contains an article by Krishan Khanna. It also contains an article by him. It even contains an article by me and some others. Please.
ये खोलना आपको दीजिए।
You are.
happy to come. Let's go. Huh? From my collection. Oh, is it? Huh? No, not this cat. Yeah, this one. Opening an event on a great poet of the 20th century. It's only appropriate that before anything else is done, his poems are read. And we have two of our friends reading. First, Kushan Khanna, who will read it in English translation, and the original in Spanish will be read by you. Then you'll read the original Spanish poem that you have chosen, and you'll read the translation. Okay. Good. There you are. You have the? Yeah. Where are the poems? I have the poems. Huh?
This is yours.
Yes.
Please.
Let me get my glasses out.
Yes. You don't have your glasses?
I have somewhere.
Yeah. You need this, Laura. I'm just giving it.
Okay.
What do you do? Sit down.
Hold it there. To be the assistant.
It's my choice. One is my choice, another is your choice. My choice is because this is the poem that Octavio Paz read when he was awarded the Nobel Prize. He was supposed to make a speech at the dinner, and what he chose was to read this poem. And it's dedicated as an homage to Ptolomeo. Soy hombre, duro poco y es enorme la noche, pero miro hacia arriba, las estrellas escriben. Sin entender, comprendo, también soy escritura, y en este mismo instante alguien me deletrea.
Wonderful. This is the poem.
Yes.
I am a man, and little do I last, and the night is enormous. But I look up, the stars right, unknowingly understand I am too written. And at the very moment, someone spells me out. Wonderful.
This one is your choice.
Yes.
And this one has been printed with this famous photography of the head of a Buddha,
Yes,
eaten by a tree. It's a beautiful edition, circulates with his poem. La cara y el viento. Bajo un sol inflexible, llanos ocres, colinas leonadas, trepé por un breñal una cuesta de cabras, hacia un lugar de escombros. Pilastras desgajadas, dioses decapitados, a veces centilleos subrepticios, una culebra, alguna lagartija, agazapados en las piedras, color de tinta ponzoñosa, pueblos de bichos quebradizos. Un patio circular, un muro hendido, agarrada a la tierra como nudo ciego, árbol todo raíces, la higuera religiosa. Lluvia de luz, un bulto gris, el Buda. Una masa borrosa sus facciones por las escarpaduras de su cara. Subían y bajaban las hormigas. Intacta todavía sonrisa, la sonrisa. Golfo de claridad pacífica.
Wonderful.
Y fui por un instante diáfano viento que se detiene, gira sobre sí mismo y se disipa.
The Face and the Wind comes from the collected poems of Octavio Paz, 57 to 87, translated by Elliot Feinberger. Beneath an unrelenting sun, ochre plains, lion-colored hills struggle up a craggy slope of goats to a place of rubble, locked columns, headless gods, surreptitiously flashes of light, a snake or some small lizard hidden in the rocks, the color of toxic ink, colonies of brittle beetles. A circular courtyard, a wall full of cracks, clutching the earth, blind not, tree, all roots, people, the religious fig, a rain of light, a grey hulk of Buddha, its features a blurred mass. Ants climbed and descended the slopes of the face, still intact. The smile, that smile, a gulf of Pacific clarity. And I was for a moment diaphanous. A wind that stops, turns on itself, and is gone.
Friends, let me tell you a bit about the book.
No, hang on. I want to read something else.
Oh, sure.
Wow.
This was actually his reply or his offering to the Swedish Academy of Letters when the commendation was reached. And it's about poetry. Between what I see and what I say, between what I say and what I keep silent, between what I keep silent and what I dream, between what I dream and what I forget, poetry.
I can say it in Spanish.
Yeah, sure. Very, very beautiful.
Entre lo que miro y lo que digo, entre lo que digo y lo que no digo, entre lo que callo y lo que sueño, entre lo que sueño y lo que olvido, la poesía.
Oh, wonderful. Sounds much. You made the translation. Yes, you made the translation.
Back to the book. We have some pieces which we have reprinted, that have been published before, notably from Shambaji, Desomanand. But mostly there are new pieces done for the book, which include Krishan Khanna, Mr. Sanchez, Himmat Shah, Kalidas, Malati Shah, Udayan Vajpayee, Carlos Vezola Navio, K. Sachidanandan, and Leela Dhuleka. In fact, we had also planned to publish a translation of about 10 poems into 6 Indian languages. Translations have been done, but the book cannot be published because in the meantime, Mrs. Paz expired, and it's not very clear as to from whom we get the copyright printed, so permission. So there's a bit of confusion there. But anyway, and now 4 of us will try to remember Paz. Ghulam Sheikh, you might start, because you have the mic. You have a mic.
I was supposed to write for the book. But I failed to meet the deadline. But I scribbled something about my experience. Well, before I read this, I remember that Paz had come because I just read online a long article that he had come in 1951. He had gone to Bombay and then to Delhi and written about his experiences. But it was around 62, 63, I cannot fully make out. But I will read this out just in order to put the whole thing into context, especially to Gujarati literature that I happen to belong to. So I wrote, how do I remember Paz? Strange though it seems, I met him only twice. First, I don't know whether it was the time when he landed second time in India, either in 62 or 63, more likely 63, that he was here already for some time. But that we happened to meet him at that point of time. But before I speak this, I must give a background of a literary group that I belong to, because this is very important in the context. I grew up before I met Paz, in a kind of a literary climate in a place called Baroda where I live. So there was a Gujarati literary group of about dozen writers in Baroda, roughly from 1958 till 1963, which met every Saturday evening at the residence of a writer-critic and political thinker, Bhogilal Gandhi. I attended it regularly in the company of young aspiring poets and writers, one of them being me. Initially, while I was a student and later as a teacher. Here, eminent literature, one of our major writers of Gujarati language, Suresh Joshi, would come with loads of books to read from. He felt it very strongly that we mostly read either British or American writers, and occasionally Russian, with little regard for other literatures, and introduced us to European and Latin American poetry and literatures. He was an avid reader and collector of books, browsing through details of new publications in international literary journals that he had made Baroda University, the university where he taught Gujarati language, subscribe for its library, international literary journals in 1950s. He also managed to acquire books and journals through his friends and erstwhile students from abroad, besides buying some from bookshops in Bombay and Baroda. It was in those literary soirees that I and we, those who attended this, learned about Lorca, Neruda and Paz, besides Rilke, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Mallarmé, etc. Initially, I was struck by the imagery in the poetry of Lorca and a sense of deep angst in Baudelaire. But we fell totally in love with Neruda and Paz. And even planned to translate Heights of Machu Picchu and Sunstone in Gujarati. At that point of time, we had planned that. Eventually, one translation of Sunstone appeared in Gujarati, translated by a poet called Jagdish Joshi in Bombay. Some of my translations made through English, of course, not through original Spanish, but we had books which were bilingual. My translations of Lorca and Neruda poem appeared in a magazine called Kshitij. It was edited by Suresh Joshi. Paz is Labyrinth of Solitude, published around the same time, came in the hands of Suresh Joshi in the days of its first publication in early 60s and became an instant hit. It circulated, because there was only one copy. So it circulated from hand to hand, from number of friends. Now about Paz. I was excited to learn from a friend, poet and critic Jayant Parekh from Bombay, who had read a newspaper report that Paz had landed in Delhi as Mexican ambassador. There was a small item which he found somewhere in the newspaper, and he conveyed it to us. It was perhaps around middle of 1963, if I am not mistaken. And I went to Delhi during that period to appear for an interview for Commonwealth scholarship to go abroad. During that period, I stayed with my, in those days, student, Vivan Sundar. That was on Racecourse Road, if I am not mistaken. Where this is now the Prime Minister's residence. This is where his father was Chief Election Commissioner of India. And his mother, Vivan's mother, Indira, was a sister of Amrita Shegil, and they lived on Racecourse Road. And they were very familiar with diplomatic circles. I asked Indira Sundaram if she could track down the Mexican ambassador. She found out that he was very much in Delhi, but was living in Ashoka Hotel. I do not know whether the building for the Mexican embassy was made or not, but he was in the hotel. So we found his number, called the secretary, and with the contact details, we managed to take an appointment with him. And Vivan, his sister Navina, and I landed at his suite in Ashoka Hotel. He was literally overjoyed meeting us. And he used words saying that I've been meeting only diplomats. He used an epithet I would not repeat, but he almost said that he was disgusted meeting people. He had not met people from art and culture, and he was delighted to meet artists. And with a great enthusiasm, he said that he had never met a single artist or a writer. So we sat down, we talked of so many things. And actually, besides poetry, we did not know what to talk about, because we were also considerably ignorant about Mexico. But he actually led us on, and he said, have you seen Mexican films? And I said, oh, there was only one film that had come to India. He said, but no, see Buñuel, see such great films. So I said, well, I am going abroad. So he said, one of the things that you are going to do when you are in Europe is to find out where these films are being shown. Then he was so kind. He in fact told me that, he said, London is okay, but go to Paris. I said, why? He said, I have many friends there. And if I remember it right, he wrote me a letter while I was in London, and he gave me the numbers of his poet friends in Paris. So he was so delighted to have met writers and artists that he, on his own, spontaneously made the gesture, and I remember it very, very fondly today. Now that was the first time that we had met. Must have spent about an hour or so, or perhaps longer. And then I introduced him to my friends, who happened to be in the process of forming a group a group called 1890. And Octavio met them in my absence. I had then left for Baroda. He met Swaminathan, he met Ambadas, he met all other friends and became so friendly. He actually visited the studios of artists and decided to write the catalogue. That exhibition was opened by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. And mind you, I'll tell you a little story. When I asked my friend Swaminathan, I said, why Nehru? Why do you want Nehruji to open our exhibition? He said, I'll tell you, because we will go and see him. Now about 6 of us marshaled ourselves to meet the Prime Minister. And Swaminathan had many friends, so he made it possible for us to meet the Prime Minister. There he was, bit broken after the Chinese war. But he said, why me? This is the question. Hum to anadi hai. This is the word he used. And Swaminathan was quick to respond, saying, sir, we haven't come to invite you as the Prime Minister. We have come to invite you as a writer, one of us. It pleased him no end. And Nehruji immediately said yes, because he wrote that book, Discovery of India, while he was in prison.
Yeah.
So we discovered a writer in him, and he was delighted to have been discovered, as a writer. Well, that is one story. The second story is, well, those few years I was abroad. I returned in 1966, and I think it must have been 67 or 68 when he resigned.
Yeah.
And there comes Swaminathan again with a long telegram telling me, Octavio Paz is leaving India. You must see to it. You must meet him. Where to meet him? So he wrote us that he was traveling by train. I think it must have been Paschim Express. Or there was no Rajdhani in those days. And he was in the first class AC compartment. And I marshaled my friend Bhupen Khakkar, and both of us went and entered his cabin. He again was very, very enthusiastic, sort of hugged us. And he said, sit down. There are only 10 minutes that the train stops here. And then for a few minutes we talked, and then as we said, we must go now. So he told Bhupen, he says, you stay back. So I got down, and he talked or murmured something in the ears of Bhupen. And when Bhupen came out, and I said, what secret did he convey to you? So first, he was a bit cagey, because Octavio must have told him not to reveal it. But because being a great friend of his, he said, Octavio told me that he liked my painting in the Triennale and that it has been given an honorable mention. That painting was People at Dharmasala. And it was on that note that we parted. He met our friends in Bombay. He went to their office. My friend Rasik Shah, one of the members of that group who happened to live in Bombay, he invited him with Gujarati and other writers. Octavio went there personally. Yeah. He loved the company of poets and writers. And he sat with them for hours together. And I remember that they also cherished this memory for a number of years. That is the two meetings that I had and meetings that Octavio had with the writers. Right.
Wonderful.
ये लिखना था पूरा आपके लिए मैं पूरा करके दूँ
Can I take your hand?
हाँ, yeah.
There are no kind of formal meetings between artists. You see each other in various places, and then it's almost taken for granted that you know each other. See? And Octavio was at one such party, and I was there, I was told Octavio was here and I should meet him. So met him, and I seem to remember, this is my first memory of the meeting. I addressed him quite conventionally, I might add, as Dr. Paz. And he said, I'm no doctor. So that was really breaking the ice in a way, because henceforth our meetings were more congenial, easy, and centered around our main interest, which was painting as well as poetry. I remember he asked me once if I would paint. He asked me what kind of painting I did. I said, well, you can't talk about what kind of painting I paint. I do paint. He said, do you paint portraits? I said, not really, but I mean, at the bench. So he said, would I paint Marie-José? So I said, yes, I'd love to. Who wouldn't? So she came up to my tiny little studio, and I was there, and Octavio came. It was becoming a bit of a performance, in fact. And I'm no portrait painter. And much as I tried, I kept failing all the time, you see. And I finally sort of submitted. I said, well, I'm a failure as a portrait painter, I'm afraid. And this is doing, Marie-Jo said, no justice at all. And he agreed with me. So that was my first meeting with Octavio. Since then, there were many others, and of course, memorably, the one I remember most was I was quietly sitting in my studio one day, and the telephone rang, and it was somebody whose voice I didn't recognize, actually, but he said, Mr. Paz would like to talk to you. So I said, yes, I'm here. So Octavio came to the phone and said, look, this is something very secret. You mustn't breathe a word of it, not even to ring my wife. You mustn't say anything about this to anyone. So I held my peace, and I thought, my God, he's asking me to, do a subterfuge for the be a second, a third rate, whatever they call them. It's something to do with politics or something. And I was very scared what this was going to be. And then he finally said, well, I would like you to be a witness to my wedding. So I said, yes, secret about it. He said, no, we don't talk about it now, when the time comes and so on. And so that's how I went there, and there was the other person there was Shamlal, who was the other signatory. And I was a little surprised because I got to know him, but there were people who were very, very friendly with him, and extremely friendly, and he admired them very much, as I did too. And I thought possibly that he would have asked Swaminathan or somebody else to be a participant in this thing. But I don't know for what reason he asked me to do it, but I gladly signed the register when it came, and it was a wonderful, very small gathering in his house, in the back lawn, and that was maybe the second, third, or fourth meeting, I can't remember which. But after that, when the Nehru Fellowship was conferred on him, he came to India, and I was called up. He called me up, I think, and said, can we meet? I said yes, and he was in Imperial, not Imperial, in the hotel. So I went there. And he said, well, I'm here now, and we talked about this and that and the other, and he said, I would like you, I'd read his poems before, I think on some occasion or other, And he said, I've been asked to receive this award, and I've been asked to read a poem, and I would like you to translate it, read the translation of it, then. And I agreed, and that's what happened. And subsequent to that, there were about half a dozen other such occasions when I was called upon to read his poems, which I did, and then he said to me very quietly one day, he says, you say you're a painter. I said, yes, I am. He said, you're a poet, really? And I said, no, I'm not a poet. I don't write. I know a lot of poetry. I mean, I have a great love for poems and poetry, but I wouldn't call myself a poet at all, And then I had this book with me, and he wrote something in it, which for the life of me, I can't read Spanish. And there it was. Can you read it for me?
Yes. Oh, I remember his writing. Al pintor y cripto poeta. Krishna Kana. Con amistad y admiración, Octavio. Y para la encantadora reina.
So quietly, I like to think that I'm a poet because he said I was. But I'm not a poet.
Octavio.
Yeah. And there were many times we met, many things one discussed. It was such a, I don't know, I mean, he was so broad in his interests and very exacting also, very in what he had to say about poetry. We discussed lots of poems and lots of poetry, including a lot of Auden and so on. And he was a very extraordinary man. I don't think one is going to see too many of that breed now, somehow. I just thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really moved of being here with you both and with you. I appreciate the distinction of being between you three. It's really, for me, very important because for many days I heard the tale of the wedding. The wedding that happened under a neem,
Yes,
the
right.
neem tree, and it became a whole mythology, the wedding under the neem. And it was really, really very important in all the life of Paz because, as you know, India transformed him. He became another person after being in India. Not only because it's here where he met Marie-José,
Yes.
and the love story is fascinating. She was married. They began to flirt in '62 when he arrived, and then half a year after, they met by chance in Paris, and they escaped. And there was a friend of them who was Henri Michaud, the poet.
Yes, Michaud.
Michaud, and Michaud had a lover who was a Vietnamese doctor, Micheline. And Micheline had an apartment, and that's where they escaped and they're hid from the world. And then they came back to India. She arranged the separation from her husband, who was like the second in the French embassy. So there was a diplomatic problem between Mexico and France. And they married. And since they married for 34 years, they never slept separated a night.
Yes.
They were together all the time. And that changed everything.
Yes, it does.
And at the time, she wrote poems too. And she published her poetry under a pseudonym. And in her poetry, there is a lot of India. And she made collages. In
Very
fact,
good, very nice.
a work of her that you can see is the third of the affiches, of these posters that you can see there. And I make a little parenthesis to thank that all this is happening between these images. Because you know, Octavio Paz was such a loved man, but all the fields of art, dance, music, and literature, of course, in Mexico, that there was a group of designers, graphic designers, who decided to read their poetry, his poetry, and make images. So they made this very special exhibition that was very much appreciated in Mexico. There is the names of the main graphic designers in Mexico, and many young ones also, because Octavio wanted so much. For example, in his magazine, he was like, the menu was always a very well-known poet and an unknown poet. So a very young and a very established one. So he always had a door open for the young. So in this exhibition, these designers invited the very well-known and the new ones. And then, thanks to Santiago Luis Sanchez and the Mexican Embassy and the Raza Foundation, there is like a second sentence to this original proposal that was meant and pronounced in Mexico to celebrate Octavio Paz, that was to invite the many very distinguished Indian graphic designers, and I know that here we have 4 of them. Yes. I will mention them if you allow me. Subhojit Roy, Shaz Ahmed, Monica K. Gulati, Amit Gulati. They all belong. Stand up. They all belong to the Association of Designers of India. And this fact of having Mexican graphic designers reading each one with their own images, the poetry of Octavio Paz, and Indian graphic designers reading each one today, the poetry of Octavio Paz with their own images, produces all this. We have 40 images, more or less half and half Indian and Mexicans. So it's like continuing what Octavio pronounced when he was here, in a way, making friendship with both of you. And I'm very happy that this came from Santiago, because Santiago, you know, when he was born, and her daughter was born, I was working with Octavio, and I worked with him for a few years, and then we became friends. And he and Marijo decided to become the godfather and godmother of my sons. Oh. So when Santi was appointed to come to the embassy here, Marijo was very enthusiastic. She called me and she said, I just called Santiago and told him that he has the challenge of continuing the line. And you are no more Santi, you are now Shanti.
Not at all.
So it's a big challenge, but I'm very happy to see that this is happening, that he made also an exhibition of Octavio's poems on Delhi, with young people showing it in the different places of Delhi that are mentioned in his poem.
Well, I must mention one thing here, which I forgot to mention actually, that on a visit, there was, Geeta was sitting there, there was 2 or 3 of us, my wife was there as well, Akbar Padamsi was there as well, and then we went for a jaunt, looking at went to Fatehpur Sikri, and then to the wildlife resort and so on. And we spent a beautiful time there, and then one evening they said, well, why don't you read the poem? And I was carrying the long poem, Sunstone.
Oh, yeah, very.
And I remember very well, we sat down, it was a very memorable evening because they were all lovely friends for one. And then with Octavio's poem, which is a fantastic poem, you know. And I sat reading this long poem, I still remember it to this day. You know, I think when poetry is recited, it matters also that it gathers unto itself the ambiance in which it was recited. And that never leaves somehow. You know, when you recite a poem, you think of the many times that it's been recited before. And there's a great association of sensibility, I think, in this thing. And I think I hold that big poem, it's a monumental poem. And I read it. I don't know, you know, if these people remember it or not. I'm sure they do. But that's the power of poetry. And for me, I'm a painter, of course, but I think really the power, it's a very incipient power which exists inside. It doesn't flare up, but it never dies. That's the other thing. It's there for all time.
Okay.
Octavio's gone, so many others before him have gone, but his poetry still is there, you know, and we are talking about it today. I think it's wonderful that we are. Thank you.
Thanks.
I've always felt some kind of a lacuna of not knowing European languages, especially because you can't read the original. Of course, in the meetings that we had, I have just spoken about, we once got a gentleman who was an income tax commissioner who knew French, and he was interested in poetry, so we got him, and he then read, you know, in front of us, Baudelaire in French.
Yeah, wonderful.
And for us it was such an experience just to listen to the sound and the music of the language. And similarly we felt equally excited when we came across poems in Spanish. As I told you that I was drawn towards Lorca in those days. And so my mentor, Sunil Joshi, he said, now the Penguins have brought out small bilingual collections, so you can read the original. And we tried hard in our own way, you know, we could not understand. But with the translation we should make up. So that famous poem called 5 in the Afternoon, it's Cinco de la Tarde, if I am not mistaken, you know, in Lorca's poem. Lorca. And then we tried to read Neruda and Paz in Spanish, although, you know, we did not understand it fully. But there is something about it which I may mention here, that even without the knowledge of the language, there is something else was in the music and in the sound of the language. They conveyed a connection which touched us. You know, it was something which perhaps some of the languages of India, our own language, you know, which has some kind of a sound of music in it, or some element of music, the way in which we speak.
All poetry does.
And when we heard Spanish, when I later on heard it recited by better poets and all that, I realized that there were some invisible connections between the Eastern languages, particularly Indian. I cannot speak about Chinese, but particularly Indian languages, and those sounds in the Latin languages which seem to melt into each other.
Very good.
Very good. I would like to make a little comment that links everything that the three of you said.
Yeah.
And I will take some elements. The element of the form as content, the importance of the gathering surrounding a poem and how it appeals something very close, and how he transformed the way of seeing the art that, as you mentioned earlier, time was like a social realism. And you know that Octavio Paz invented himself 3 times in his life. reinvented himself. The first, and the three of them are linked to India.
Yeah.
First, as a preface, as a prehistory of what you said. He was very young, he was an engaged poet, he was a social realist poet, almost.
Yeah.
And he went to the War of Spain. And in the War of Spain, there was a congress of artists that was anti-fascist artists. In fact, with the years, we knew that it was organized by the Stalinism. Yeah. And what happened there, that was he met very interesting and important poets who were in the same line, Neruda between them, and others. Bergamin in the Spanish field was like one of the leaders of the Stalinism. And one thing that he discovered, he made two poems. The first one is No Pasarán, which is like a logo of fight in the street. And the second one was dedicated to the death, he had the news of the death, of a young Spanish man who was his friend when he was in high school. And this man, Juan Bosch, was expelled from Mexico for his political activity, even he was very young. And then he came to the war of Spain, and the news were spread that he was dead. When he read his first poem in Madrid, what he discovered is that he felt himself as a creator, but in fact, he was repeating the same images that were written, none the other but Stalin. The future, the radiant future of humanity, for example. All the poets repeated that. He noticed that he was repeating Stalin, none other brilliant poet but Stalin. By the way, Stalin was a brilliant young poet before becoming the necessary criminal of the revolution. And he hated that, and he really didn't know what to do because he discovered that he was almost stopping being a poet to become a publicist.
Absolutely.
And then he went to Barcelona and he read a more personal poem about the death of his friend. And when he was reading that, he saw a young man crossing by behind the scene, and it was his friend that was supposed to be dead. And he was about to say hello, and the friend said, no, shut. We will meet later. And the brother hid, because the friend was a Trotskyist. And the Stalinists had the order of not expelling, but killing all the Trotskyists. And they did. And the way of hiding of this man was to say that he was dead. And so he discovered that reality was much more complex than he did. And then he came back to Mexico, and he went to Mexico through Paris. And in Paris there was a huge art exhibition. It was already 1937. And in this exhibition, he discovered two works of art that changed his idea of the world and of the creation. Was the Guernica by Picasso and a very engaged abstract painting by Joan Miró, one which is lost by the way, is called Red Peasant. And he discovered that there was a way of being engaged without being demagogical.
That's right.
To talk about history and society without belonging to a party, obeying and repeating political leaders. Okay. So he went back to Mexico. He threw away the 5 books he already published. He put them in pieces, chose like 10 poems of these 5 books, and rewrote his first book, learning, because what he discovered is that Guernica and Miró were that Picasso and Miró were embedded in the languages of the avant-gardes, in the instruments of the avant-gardes. And when he came back, he said, what the avant-gardes can teach to Latin American or Spanish-speaking poetry that has not been done. And he developed a whole theory about the extended poem and simultaneism. And the product of that research is a poem named Sunstone, the one you mentioned. So the Sunstone is the poem by which he reinvented himself. And when he did that, he transformed the art in Mexico. He gave to the Mexicans the opportunity of thinking themselves as creators in another way. And that changed Mexico. And at the end of the 50s, many years, because he came to Paris and then he came back, he provoked something that was called La Ruptura, the break. It was against the muralists, the Diego Rivera and Siqueiros and all the muralists. And he proposed a new generation of painters and writers who were really a kind of neo-avant-garde. And then he was very proud of coming almost 10 years later to India and to the same with all of you.
Wonderful.
Well, back to Sunstone. My friend Kamlesh, who was in Delhi at that time when Octavio was here.
Who? Say that again?
Kamlesh.
Yeah.
He translated this long poem into Hindi. And since I was a friend, he gave it to me for reading. Till then, I had vaguely known that there is some poet called Paz and that. And it was a very good translation. Incidentally, it was Octavio Paz who changed the view of translation of poetry. The usual thing which used to be said was, poetry is what is lost in translation. Paz, on the other hand, said, poetry is what survives translation.
That's right.
That's
right.
That's what
the poem.
So, I read this poem, and those days, there used to be a restaurant called Shalimar.
Where we used to meet.
Yeah,
89.
where I saw you first and Himmat first and all that. On the mezzanine floor, you used to have your paintings stocked. So there I met Swaminathan, Shrikant Verma, I and Kamlesh were sitting, and I met Swaminathan. And then after that, the poem came along.
Swaminathan was
So
wonderful for it.
once I told Swaminathan that he's here, why don't I sometimes meet him? So I went one day and I said, Swami, chalo. Now, we landed up at Prithviraj Road, residence of Paz, without notice. And as we were sort of about to enter, Paz came out. He was ready to go somewhere. So he told Swami, why didn't you give me a ring? Swami said, no, okay. So he said, where would you go now? So Swami said, I am going to Connaught Place and we'll drink some beer. So Paz said, okay, I'll drop you. So we got in his car, dropped. There was no Palika Bazaar at that time. There used to be a park, kind of a big park there. So Swami went and bought some bottle of beer and we were sitting there drinking, of course, stealthily and illegally. And then, after about an hour, Paz returned. He said, Ari, I was feeling uncomfortable that you were all sitting here. So he took us back to the past.
Exactly that.
The second was, when he came for this Jawaharlal Nehru Fellowship or whatever it was, at Shrikant Verma's place, there was a big party.
I went there.
You were there.
Yes,
Shamlalji was there.
Yes.
And many others were there. And it was decided that the three of them,
Would write a poem.
Paz, Shrikant Verma and Agge, they will jointly write a poem.
Poem, yes. I have the right to do it.
Each one wrote a line.
Yeah.
The first line was, I think, written by Agay, who was the senior, then the second one by Paz, and it's a
There's a very cool.
9-line poem. Each one wrote one line.
How nice.
It was wonderful.
When Swami came to Bhopal, I saw in his collection a book on Paz, of Paz, on Dusha. Called, translated into English, it was called Castle of Purity.
Yeah.
The copy which I had given to Swaminathan had an inscription like on your copy, but this time in English. Says, so Swaminathan, who does not live in a castle, but in furious purity. Octavio Paz. So that was we were planning a World Poetry Festival. And Swami and I agreed that the person we should somehow get should be Paz.
Of course.
So this is 1989. And Paz was not keeping well.
Yeah.
But, Swami's insistence and all that. So he said, let me consider if my doctors permit me. The journey is very long, this, that, and the other. Finally, Paz could not come because he was not well or whatever. So there has been a kind of a relationship, and Paz became an important international poet who had impact on Indian poetry in many languages. He is one of the poets who have been translated into Hindi, into Bengali, into Malayalam, into Marathi, into Korea, I'm sure
Wonderful.
In other languages. And his poems, he wrote a book later called In Light of India, which is a book about India. And there is the last chapter mentions you all. All the Hussain, Ramkumar, Swaminathan,
All the roads.
Rishit Khanna, all the artists are mentioned, Shamlal Dey is mentioned, many of these people are mentioned. We had, when I took over my most disastrous assignment, chairmanship of the Lalit Kala Academy, there were 10 years or something of Paz's death. So I said, let's do something. And we do a thing called Paz Mandala. Because Paz has a mandal, and and we took out paintings of all those artists who had figured
In that first exhibition.
and whom he had mentioned. So there was a Hussain painting, your painting, all the two painting, 19 painting, a big photograph and all that. And we did an exhibition, and there was also a seminar. So, in other words, I'm trying to tell you somewhat politely, or perhaps not so politely, that this is not the first time that India is remembering Paz. We remember him once, and this is the second time. And we will continue to remember him because poets and artists of India owe gratitude
That's right.
to what he did.
That's right.
Thank you.
Very good.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the evening. What?
No.
You may go around the exhibition if you haven't. Most of you perhaps have not. And feel free. Day after, at 4 o'clock, we have a seminar. 4:30. Okay. We have a seminar here where some of the scholars will be speaking about Paz. So you're most welcome to join us. And then on 25th, we show a film by which we close the event.
Wonderful.
So you are all most welcome. And tell all others who haven't been able to come what they have missed, and they need not miss it further. Which means they can come day after, and they can come and see the film. Copies of the books will be available